When Beth and I had been married for a couple years, we moved into a kind of a bigger house, and shortly after we did, my parents showed up with one of those small moving trucks without warning. They didn't tell me they were bringing it. My dad actually called about an hour before we got there and said, we're coming down and we're bringing a lot of stuff. He said, and I just think you should warn Beth. They showed up with, I think, everything I had ever touched as a child. My mom said, "This is yours now." And I thought, I didn't save it. Like, I'm not the one who cut these out. But she left it with me and headed home. And so I spent the next several weeks sorting through these boxes of stuff. And I'm going to be honest, it was a strange experience to sort through the accomplishments of my childhood, to find these things that I had worked so hard for when I was in high school or middle school or elementary school, and to realize that they didn't matter. As I sat on that side of those things, I realized that so much of what I had tried to do and to accomplish and had wanted to achieve just didn't hold up. I threw it all away. I didn't keep any of it because it just didn't seem to be worth anything. Have you ever looked at the things that you've tried to accomplish in your life? Have you ever looked at the accolades you've tried to garner or the things that you've tried to take hold of and realized that maybe they mattered less than what you thought? It's not that I've stopped trying to achieve or be noticed. That continues to be a story of my life that I wrestle with. It's just that I've tried to achieve and be noticed for other things. As Paul begins to lay out for us his accomplishments and accolades, and when Paul begins to lay this out, we realize that Paul is a man of significant value, and we begin to wonder in this moment as we read, is Paul going to pull a humble brag? You know what a humble brag is? It's when somebody says things like, well, I can't afford a nice car because I give most of my money to the poor. They're trying to be humble, but at the same time, they're trying to build themselves up. And just when we think Paul's about to do that, he drops this line on us that should make us stop. Yet whatever I had as gain, I count as loss when compared to knowing Christ. It seems that Paul realizes that all the things that he had pursued in his life would not fulfill him or sustain him or keep him. And so as he stands there, he realizes that he must make the decision to set aside his accolades that he might pursue Christ. It's interesting, the words that Paul uses. He uses a Greek verb here that's in the perfect tense, which is important because it means that at one point he made the decision to turn away from these things, but that decision is a decision that he continues to make every day. We live in a world that is so driven by success, by accolades, by having the right letters after your name, and what Paul says is that is worthless compared to knowing Christ. He makes 3 statements about kind of what he longs to know. The first thing he says is, I want to gain Christ. It's interesting that Paul uses this phrase, I want to gain Christ, because he's really kind of making a profit-loss statement. He's starting to make a pro-con list. You ever made a pro-con list? We're talking about getting a puppy in our house, and so we're making a pro-con list, like pro, the kids will like the puppy. Con, we'll have kids and a puppy. He says, I want to gain Christ, and I want to be found in him. We don't like to talk about judgment. It wouldn't be my first choice. But what Paul dives into when he uses this phrase, that I would be found in him, is really that there is a day coming when he's going to stand before God and have to defend himself before God. And Paul says, I've done all the right things based on the law. But friends, that isn't enough. The thing that will allow Paul to stand in judgment before God is that he has been found in Christ. We no longer have to strive to do things our own way, but instead we are set free to live as people who know Christ and are covered by Christ. The freedom that we experience just in that is beautiful. Then he says, not only do I want to gain Christ with this relationship and know the freedom that Christ offers, but I want to know the power of his resurrection. Paul is saying very clearly that he does not just want to know the history of Jesus, he wants to know Jesus. Paul says, I want to know the power of God that sets people free. We live in a world that is hurting in a real way, and we light candles today to remember that our world is hurting. The world that we live in desperately needs to know the power of the resurrection. And we are the ones who live that out. Paul says, I haven't gotten there yet, but I press on. He says to run that race means that you have to forget what lies in the past, forgetting what is behind. I keep my eyes on the finish line. For a long time, I heard this passage, and when I would read that, I would think, man, the things that Paul are forgetting are maybe his failures and his baggage, but I think maybe now what Paul is encouraging us is to forget is our successes. Run well, friends. Run well. Because the world needs to know the freedom and the power and the hope that comes from Christ, that can only be seen in us when we set aside ourselves.